Hi, I'm Liz.
And I'm Rhea.
Welcome to Karma's My Bitch, a podcast about love,
sex,
connection,
abundance,
joy,
purpose,
peace,
and how life isn't simply the stories we tell ourselves. Back to relationships, my favorite topic. Very excited, and I'm going to talk about it. But the first thing I'm going to say is the catching people up bit, which is when we are in our karma, our relationships will always reflect back to us to some degree our not good enough story. There are many a season and an episode on this. It's almost sad to be talking about this now, considering we just had a whole season of relationships out of karma and what if karma never existed. However, just to recap for those who only started in season 10, which to be honest, I would probably totally understand because it was quite a fun season. But effectively, when we're in our karma, therefore we're not feeling good enough, our relationships always reflect that back to some degree. Effectively, no one can make us feel anything, right? What we're effectively doing is we're seeing how we feel against the mirror of someone else, right? So that's why you can have 4 relationships where you feel very in love. You can have many relationships where you feel super shit. And it always feels like the same thing keeps happening over and over and over again. Yes, maybe some things keep happening over and over again, and one must look at their behavior and their choices and see how they're creating self-fulfilling prophecies. But ultimately, every relationship we have will mirror back our shit and our light, which means that once we're out of our fear, our ego, and our karma, and we're holding more light, and we are shining our light for others to see, so we're practicing capital L love, those relationships take on a different hue, because we're not just seeing our reflection of our not good enough story anymore, because we don't have that. They're actually showing us lots of other things as well. But my concern is that because of the dynamics and patterns that were created in our karma, so for example, some of the expectations we hold, or some of the patterns that we have in separation of what it means to be a pursuer or a pursuee, chased or be chased, who pays, who doesn't pay, all these things that we've kind of just like inherently absorbed and made them into rules and concrete evidence rather than just things that we've socialized into rules which aren't really rules at all. They still end up kind of like reflecting some of that not good enough story back to us, especially when the other person has their own karma, because then we're playing into their story. So even though we're not naturally carrying karma of our own, someone else has karma, right? And if someone else has karma, then they will constantly be making us into part of their karmic story. And I can say this in, let's say, fine, we can talk about relationships in terms of romantic relationships, but even friendships and stuff, you know, where someone's really playing in their story and they're very insecure and they constantly want to put other people down in order to feel good about themselves. And you're in the firing line, you're going to get put down too. And, you know, for a while you can be like, oh, I have compassion. It's just their shit and it's nothing to do with me. Or just in any relationship, you're like, oh, it's just their shit. They're worried about being abandoned, or they're nervous about being rejected, or whatever else. But ultimately they still like affect you because the energy isn't flowing freely. And everything is just that little bit harder. You always used to say that after like this post-karmic thing, and once we've done our karmic undoing, that relationships shift, they end and they implode in order for us to put new opportunities and patterns into our lives. And at first I used to find that really, really uncomfortable because I was like, but I love all my friends. I love all my relationships. I love everything. I want everything.
I don't want anyone to go anywhere.
No. And, you know, and as a caveat, and I laughed with you about this yesterday, at the same time of thinking that everything was going to end and I was going to be left alone, nothing's really ended and I'm not alone. And in fact, some of my biggest players in my karmic story are somehow around in my life in one way or another. They haven't gone anywhere. But what's interesting is that A, I no longer have the same dynamics with them because I've merely just unplugged from them. But B, when it came to finding someone to actually build a life with, I didn't necessarily want someone who I'd played such a karmic story with. I wanted someone who I didn't have to prove that I was good enough now, if that makes sense, because I behaved in a way that kept reinforcing the story that I wasn't for so long. And actually, in order to wire a new way of harmony and oneness and all the behaviors that contribute to both of those things, it was actually better for me to be in relationships where I hadn't brought all my baggage into them. Yes, I'd brought some doubts. Yes, I brought some insecurities. Yes, of course, like, you know, when it comes down to it, when one's in a relationship, having kind of come out of their karma and all of that stuff. And yeah, you may not know you're good enough, but you've never had a relationship where you're totally in, like, knowing yourself and in yourself. So it's actually quite a difference. So you're going to naturally come into it with doubts and insecurities because you don't know if it can happen because it's never happened before, right? And so few relationships that healthy, really healthy, non-karmic relationships are modeled for us. It's so hard to know what's even possible. But yeah, it just gets all a bit messy. And
yeah, I have a question. I have a question for you. So earlier when you were talking about...
You want to interrupt my monologue? Okay, sure.
Well, just to kind of have a little bit of a conversation. Why not?
Yeah.
I know. I'm kind of here, so...
Yeah, why not? You should just listen to me.
No, just kind of going back to something you said earlier. And this is actually something maybe you would have asked me, but I'm going to ask you, actually. So earlier when you were talking about... So maybe you're in your post-karmic life, right? You've gone through your karmic undoing process and everything. But sometimes being around somebody who's still in their karma, you can end up playing into their story.
Yeah.
And so you and I have discussed in our book, well, like attracts like.
Yeah.
Sometimes, how is it that we end up, if even outside of our karma and after our karmic undoing process, that we end up with people and they're still in their karma?
I think, well, with friends, it's easier, right?
To explain?
Yeah. You know, you've had friends your whole life, and sometimes people are friends out of habit rather than anything else. So just because you're going through your karma and coming out of it doesn't mean your friends are, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not really like attracts like in the same way, right? Because you like it did attract like, and then at some point you evolved out of it, yet you remained in it. New people coming in with karma, I actually don't know the answer. I've wondered that myself. I mean, for me, I think it's more like sometimes you might meet people who are in their karma, but what you see is the parts of your light that you maybe haven't seen before. So they're not actually that it's not the karmic like attracts like that's attracting each other. It's the light attracts light bit that's attracting each other.
Mm-hmm. Could be, yeah.
That would be kind of what I would put forward as a theory. Otherwise, and I remember you saying this to me once, sometimes it's just your doubts and your insecurities, right? Mm-hmm. So whilst you may not be in your karma, if you're still behaving in a way that you might as well be in it, then you're going to get someone who's behaving in a way that they might as well be in it too.
Exactly. That definitely reinforces those. I definitely agree, where it could be light attracts light as much as like attracts like, right? And so you could definitely be connecting on a particular plane. And I think that might answer some issues or some questions on, from listeners who might just be like, yeah, but this person I met, it's, I can tell they're feeling unlovable, but, when we're together, X, Y, Z, like, why can't it be, right? And why?
And maybe it can be, but that's also up to them to, if they come out of their karma.
But at least when one is in the karmic story, it's a really difficult one to call, or you don't want to have to be the one to call it. But I'm just getting to move on. I just had to ask those questions. I mean, you're pretty spot on about that.
Okay.
I expected you to be. You're the relationship expert in the room, so.
I love relationships, but I do actually wonder to myself sometimes, like, what the fuck is the point of... You get to do lots of fun stuff, and that's really fantastic. But for everything else, like the idea, like when you were just talking about it, I thought, oh my God, imagine falling in love with someone in your karma when you're not. And then you're having to go through all of that, and like how shitty it is. And I was just like, oh, like why can't relationships be easier? And like, why do they have to be so uncertain?
And unsettled,
yeah,
and annoying and constantly shifting. But in 5D, everything shifts. That foundation that we talked about in terms of the 4 pillars of trust that form the foundations of love, which is effectively what kind of creates those, like, that firm foundation in which everything else can root, right? Which is what allows for harmony and flow. So even though there's movement, it's a bit like, I'm sure I've used this metaphor before, but in California, I grew up in an earthquake state. And the way that they build the buildings is that their foundations are on rollers. So when earthquakes happen, the buildings are allowed to move, right? So they don't just kind of crumble. Because if it's so firm and if it can't move with all the shaking and movement, they'll just kind of come down. at some point, and this is part of the beauty of the karmic undoing process, is that it gets you used to uncertainty, you know?
Yeah, it just gets you used to just being like, you know what, I'm going to just go for it and whatever happens, happens.
Exactly. So
And in my case, it's I'm going to just love fearlessly, because love seems to neutralize all the parts of separation between me and this other person. Whether or not we walk away from each other, at the end of it, almost doesn't matter, because the experience of sharing my love with another is so fun that it doesn't matter.
But we think that if we're operating out of uncertainty, that means in sort of relationship dating guidelines, if you will, that you need to create some kind of certainty, right? Figuring that out. I don't know what that really means or looks like. But if you are okay, because you can operate from your own knowing, from your own self, your fullest expression, going back to episode 1, your individuality, that's effectively showing yourself all the loyalty. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of also similar. Again, I don't know why I'm referencing it again, but it's like karmic attraction stuff. We're talking about compromise and settling and all that kind of stuff. Is that I wasn't going to be able to show any commitment to anyone else until I committed to myself. And being able to commit to myself and showing myself that loyalty and being able to trust myself made me trustworthy, because I upheld my word, because it was my word.
Yeah. So holding to your values effectively keeps you from having to put up with a lot just to be able to keep the peace.
Yeah, of course, right? Because then actually what ends up happening is you blow. So that's when things like, they came out of nowhere. And I'm like, well, it did it. But actually, in a relationship where you're like open and you're honest and you're communicating to a degree, it doesn't feel like, baby, today I felt all these feelings towards you. First I was happy, then I was angry, then I was sad, and then I was fine, and then you did this. And it doesn't, I'm not saying that's necessary, but I'm just saying that, you know, over time you get to know somebody, and you know when they say something and they mean it, then things don't come out of the blue. They don't sideswipe you in the same way. That's the issue with kind of like keeping things as they are. Oh, I'll just silence this for the sake of the family. I'll silence this for the sake of harmony. I'll silence this for the sake of someone else's happiness. It actually keeps us in a loop of unhappiness with pockets of happiness / relief, because you're like, oh, okay, we're not fighting right now, so that's good.
Or they seem contented enough. They'll leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can just go about my merry way.
Exactly. I've said what I needed to say. I've done what I needed to do.
Yeah.
Rather than actually allowing us to discover what happiness means.
Yeah. So even if we're hitting some bumps, you know, for our growth and evolution along the way,
it's not rocking the foundations of every relationship I'm in.
No, exactly. We're going to be okay. But most of the time, people don't trust that. They can't be certain. So they'll do anything they can to create that certainty, even if it's just in their minds.
Well, that's why I guess developing that internal barometer of trust means that you're closer to being happy, which is how I guess love and happiness somehow intertwine. Because, well, if trust is the foundation of love and having trust ensures your greatest happiness, then they do feed into one another.
There is an intersection of love on the path to happiness. That's about as far as we can go.
Prioritizing your happiness, as in I'm not going to capitulate to someone else so they're happy so I'm unhappy, or I'm not going to compromise so that they're happy so I'm not happy, actually makes the whole relationship unhappy. And this is kind of what I've realized is that, you know, when you talked about in maybe 2 episodes ago, like 2 halves of a whole, right? Well, we know that's not true. We know that each one of us is whole. However, when 2 people come together, it's the energy they bring to it that creates the energy of the relationship between them, right? So if someone's coming in unhappy, resentful, compromising, not in their full light for whatever reason, then the relationship can't ever reach its full potential for that reason. And it could be you, it could be the other person, most likely, because as we said, like attracts like, as well as light attracts light. So there will be some way where the energy is leaking. It's not living up to its full potential. And often that full potential is because one of you or the other one is giving away their light to source the other one, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Or try to like source the relationship. But what happens then is that the relationship isn't 2 happy people having a relationship. The relationship is one satisfied person having a relationship where the other one is unsatisfied, or more likely the relationship was where one person is already unsatisfied And then the other one becomes unsatisfied to join them.
And then we tell ourselves that, the certainty and predictability of the relationship by compromising ourselves to our misery gives us some comfort.
Oh, we've been together for this long, therefore we'll be together forever.
We've created this life together. We're so far down this road.
Which is why it's like so crazy when you hear of like older people divorcing.
No,
You
maybe
finally
because
got to the
they
companionship place,
But
and now
did
you're
they?
gone.
But
But
did
that's what I'm
they?
saying. That's the
Yeah.
truth of it, right? Like actually,
Right.
longevity doesn't guarantee forever.
No, because
Like just
comfort
because
is
you were
not.
together for a week doesn't mean you'll be together forever. Just as much as just because you were together for years doesn't mean you'll get married and live forever either. I've known of relationships, well, my parents' relationship, they got engaged after 3 weeks, love at first sight kind of style. Fucked me for quite a while, as you can imagine. And then I've known of other people who've been in a relationship for 10, 12 years. They get married within a year, they're divorced. Right? There is no guarantees in relationships because there's no guarantees in our lives in that kind of sense. All we can do is choose the other person day by day or not. And we're only able to choose the other person when we know how to choose. And we only know how to choose when we're choosing for ourselves.
Yeah. And when we're really making choices that ensure our greatest happiness, right? From that path, we have to understand that happiness is unbending. So whatever we are doing on that path to happiness, we do not bend. We do not compromise. We do not see that it is asking of us to capitulate in order to effectively meet that ultimate end goal, as we discussed a couple episodes ago, which is bliss, right?
All I would say to you is this. Can you imagine choosing for your own happiness and the other person choosing for their own happiness and it happens to be each other? Right? Mm-hmm. How much better is it that you're being unbending in your own happiness and someone joins you in that space rather than someone you're capitulating to join someone else or they're capitulating to join you? It's like being able to match at the highest expression rather than having to lower. That's possible. And the only thing that's standing in that way is like settling, because the other thing I used to do all the time is that I wouldn't even ask for what I wanted. I wouldn't even try to be remotely, not even unbending. I wouldn't try to be anything, because if I wasn't perfect for the other person, then they wouldn't choose me at all. But I would never then know if I was ever being chosen. And that really sucks, because then how are you going to get confidence from that? How are you going to get excitement from that? How are you going to get that joy from that? Because all you know is that someone's choosing you based on how you have chosen them, rather than they're choosing you because of you. And then the second point I would give, and I've said this before, I know I have, is that naturally as humans, we tend to be attracted to what we believe we lack. And we always used to joke. I used to go for like exceptionally skinny men when I thought my bum was too big, or I'd go for people who had a lot of success when I didn't feel so successful, or things like that, right? But at the same time, and twist on it, at the same time, there was also certain things about me that I loved. Like, I loved how smart I was. I loved how giving I was. I loved how kind I was. And being able to like connect with people who were similar to me actually made me love myself more, because I was loving me. And that kind of unconditional love in oneself and being drawn to people who exude that same thing, there's nothing like it.
No, but it is really easy for us to say this, having come through everything we have and having learned everything we have.
And written so much about it and experience. I mean, more
Precisely.
than anyone else. That's why we bitch about the books sometimes, about the earlier ones, because I was so drowning in my karma. My life was really torture, especially when it came to relationships, because there was so much of me that was like hinged around my worth, and I just wanted to be stable and secure and get to the end of the book so I could do all the things I wanted to do. And it was really difficult to not have that. And I was willing to give everything to getting it just so I could start the next chapter. And it wasn't about like desperate to get married or desperate to have kids or anything like that. If anything, we joke I was a bit of a commitment phobe. It was more like, I just need to skip to the end and know I'm going to be okay and have everything I want.
Yeah.
And in order for me to know that, I'm just going to have to give away bits of myself now, and the payoff will be worth it. And in the end, all I ended up finding was I was a shadow of myself. I didn't know who I was, and no one was around to enjoy me. But then I look now at my relationships, and not just like romantic relationships or anything like that, but just all my relationships, and being able to bring my full light self to them as me, and still being chosen, and still laughing, and still having a great time, and not settling, and all of the rest coming from it. There's nothing better. That comfort isn't happiness. Security isn't happiness. Right?
Yeah. That's actually the disease that precludes us from ever achieving true happiness, because happiness isn't complacent, right?
It doesn't settle.
Mm-mm.
You know, it's not necessarily about, X, Y, Z equals, happy emoji. It's not necessarily about the kind of long-term or short-term, or even, it's not even time defined.
No,
right?
It's not.
It just is. And as long as we are, we're going to be learning new ways of being happy and increasing on that happiness. Mm-hmm. It's always constant. It's always moving. That requires like a great deal of trust in ourselves, because that means we're not going to be making outcome-based choices like doing A will get me to B and then it'll be fine. Like just I was saying in my example, just giving a bit of myself away will be fine because then I'll be with X and Y and we'll do this and that. And
well, if I don't say that this bothered me, then they'll think I'm easygoing, and then therefore we'll get another date. And the more dates we have, because I'm not being my full self, the more that will afford me the belief that we have potential, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it just allows us to live. I mean, we're just constantly living in a sea of illusions, swimming in that sea over and over.
It's making me feel really sad inside.
Trying really hard to not drown. But we have to be able to trust yourself that you're not going to be doing that, but also just understanding moment to moment, we are stringing all of these opportunities for happiness together so that the more we experience them, the more that reality gets reflected back to us. So it's not just pockets of happiness, but we are creating happiness with every single moment, present moment, right?
So is effectively happiness,
mm-hmm.
and I'm just curious if I'm understanding this correctly.
No worries.
How we get to happiness is effectively, you have a moment of happiness, and you have another moment of happiness, and you have a moment of happiness, and experience makes normal. It's effectively happiness makes normal in this instance.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is?
To a certain degree, yes.
Okay.
The basic point of this episode has effectively been achieved, right? Happiness is unbending. And therefore, if we are not compromising and selling ourselves short, we're not contributing to this disease or malaise that we experience in relationship, which is, the more of myself I give to this relationship, the more energy it has, and then therefore it will last longer. And the longer it lasts, the more I can ensure a certain amount of comfort and predictability and certainty. And by doing that, I can at least tell myself that I have some kind of contentment, and therefore convince myself that I am happy, and I can use this relationship as a gauge for my happiness. That is this episode in a nutshell.
Okay.
But every choice we make that is born from that personal space of happiness, of pure self-expression, will lead us to consistently better and better relationships, better and better moments in which we can claim and reclaim our happiness, not through other people.
Because we know created for ourselves?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. For more information, articles, and inspiration, find us at karmasmybitch.com and at karmasmybitch.insta.
And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review.